Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sadea's Design Charcha. I'm Archana Shekhara, and joining me is Amrita Datta and also our guest, Dori Griffin. So I would love to talk about what Design Charcha is. Design Charcha is insightful dialogue series featuring creative practitioners whose research and collaborations transfers beyond the South Asian diasporic context and perspectives. The Design Charcha series manifests in form of open conversations, presentations, collaborations, and dialogues. Charcha translates to discussion, debate, or discourse in several South Asian languages. This series aims to bridge the gap between transcontinental perspectives and research by inviting participants from beyond South Asian diaspora. Sadea invites practitioners from diverse disciplines, including designers, filmmakers, artists, educators, animators, and cultural and creative workers from around the globe to share this expansive intellectual space. So, welcome, Dori, and I give this to Amrita who will introduce you.
Thank you, Archana. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Dori Griffin. So, Dr. Dori Griffin is an associate professor of design and visual communication at the University of Florida School of Art plus Art History. She specializes in the history of 20th century print media and its diverse cultural contexts. Her most recent book, Type Specimens, takes a global approach to contextualizing typographic history from practitioners' viewpoints. Griffin holds a PhD in design history from Arizona State University and an MFA in graphic design from the University of Florida. Together with her students, she takes a hybrid, both and an approach to design history and practice. So thank you, Dori.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you especially for the invitation. I really enjoy my work as a teacher and a researcher, and one of the things that's really important to me is that all of my students see themselves in the work that we do together in the design history classroom. And I am fortunate enough to have had some students who have then specialized with their own personal research in design history on Southeast Asian topics. So I've had the chance to learn from them, which is kind of the most exciting part of my job, really. And I am just very thrilled and honored to be here with you today. So I am going to share my screen. And as I put this talk together, I was sharing, as we tested out all of the technology, that putting these slides together in this particular order to focus not just on all of the research that I had done for this book on type specimens, but to try to focus specifically on how my position as a human who has a context interacted with doing research on languages I couldn't read, alphabets I couldn't read, and how that complexity kind of played out as I was researching type specimens. And I'm hoping to, as I will share a little bit more about in just a minute, I'm hoping to perhaps write an article about this. So this has been a really generative process for me, looking back, yes, but also looking forward. So for folks who might be watching the recording a little bit later on, a type specimen is basically a poster or a book or now a website that's selling fonts to printers and designers. And so my book, Type Specimens, is all about how typography as a professional practice has traveled around the globe, and the complexities, sometimes the violence of that story. I wrote this book because of Beatrice Ward, who was introduced to me by my Typography 1 professor, which was kind of unusual given that I was a student in the late 1990s And women weren't necessarily well represented at all in the materials that we encountered in the studio. Of course, as I came to recognize, sadly not in the late 1990s, but a little bit later, Beatrice and I are both white ladies, right? So we were excluded from graphic design history as women, but we were included in graphic design history in terms of the language we spoke, the alphabet we used, the racial categories that we fell into. So as I shared, thinking a little bit more about my context and positionality and how that impacts the way that I teach graphic design history. So I wanted to share with you a couple of paragraphs because I think they're relevant to what we're talking about here today, which is how the complexities of our own positions impact the research that we're doing, particularly as we seek to globalize design history. So as a BFA student in the late 1990s, I wasn't able to take design history coursework because it just wasn't offered at my university. This was a small state teaching university where I had amazing professors who inspired me to love teaching so much that I wanted to become a teacher. But we didn't have design history coursework. These professors introduced in the studio what came to be called the canon of graphic design history, something that Martha Scotford wrote about in the early 2000s. I was really eager to take every single art history course that I could. These were surveys of fill in the blank. And they placed my understanding of graphic design's canon adjacent to that of architecture most intuitively. Then as an MFA student, I didn't take formal design history coursework because it wasn't offered. And then finally, as a PhD student in design with a concentration in design history, I studied with a major professor who was an interior design historian. And her survey of interiors, decorative arts, textiles expanded my notion of the canon to include interiors. I was a GTA in a first year history of graphic design survey. It was a 2 semester survey. It was taught from Meggs's textbook, which by then was canonical for the discipline. And so I participated in introducing the baby graphic designers to famous names, familiar styles. This was a large Research One state university, and graphic design history at that time was a recently added requirement for studio majors, taught by an adjunct lecturer who was an industrial designer. And I think this is a pretty standard story for my chronological peers. As BFA and MFA students, we just didn't study design history as its own discipline because for most of us, it simply wasn't an option. That coursework didn't exist. So today, our students are studying with us, um, middle-aged people who have come to design history maybe late, maybe sideways. Um, and in best case scenarios, this is a passion project for us. And then in worst case scenarios, institutional and organizational structures give graphic design history to people who feel unequipped, perhaps, to teach it, scared of teaching it, uninterested in teaching it, intimidated by teaching it. Um, but I've always known that this is exactly what I want to do. I want to interrogate the patterns of the past in order to understand where we are in our present moment so that we can design better futures, futures that are better for all of us as humans and for the world that we live in. Um, as I do this with my students, I'm hoping to help them critically evaluate the landscape that they design in, their sources, their inspirations, their contexts, the variable meanings that are part of all of that. Um, by approaching context with curiosity, oh, gracious. Bad things have now happened to my slides. By approaching context with curiosity, what I'm really hoping to do is help all of us figure out how to collaborate with people in a way that's effective and respectful because people are diverse. We change. We each have our own intersectional positionality. We're all approaching questions slightly differently. So how might I, as a visual communication design researcher and historian, help my students develop the capacity for respectful and contextually appropriate human collaboration? I realized pretty early on that if I want to situate students in relationship to their discipline, then the story has to include them. It can't leave them out because it can't be their discipline if they don't see themselves in it. So the first time I taught a history of design survey all the way through, with global examples in every lecture was in 2015, and I'd been working toward this goal for several years at that point. And in 2015, there weren't necessarily a whole lot of resources available for this kind of work. I was at an R2 university, a public university that happened to have a fairly high percentage of Persian students, and this was reflected in the design program. So, as part of the effort to situate students in relationship to their discipline, when we talked about manuscript culture, for instance, we talked about Persian and Arabic translations of De Materia Medica, a classical text that was translated into Arabic and into Persian. Um, a lot of knowledge about herbs, plants, medical practice. We're seeing a doctor on the far left mixing medicines with honey, so that they'll go down easier, one supposes. On the left, an image from 1224 CE, and then on the middle and the right, images from the same manuscript, a 13th century present day Iraq manuscript. So, as I wanted to situate these emergent practitioners in relationship to the history of their discipline, I started seeking out examples that spoke to the students who were in my classrooms. And this was an important part of the approach that I was taking to type specimens as a book. Similarly, since typographic printing is important to the history of design, I wanted to think with students about how type circulates, how it communicates, sometimes how it colonizes. So understanding global typographic networks is really helpful. I was excited to find this example of Chinese printing taking place in mid-century New Zealand as I was looking at the history of global type foundries. I really do suggest the article that I've cited on the screen, the single object. It's an online blog about single objects that are important to history and to human experience. But this specific typeface was imported to New Zealand from Hong Kong in 1952, expressly for the purpose of printing the New Zealand Chinese Citrus Growers Monthly Journal. And so, trying to take a global and inclusive perspective is also a process of following footnote almost to the end of the universe and tracking down instances of intercultural exchange, and thinking about how typography circulates. So with these examples in mind, a slight turning of attention to thinking about why I was even bothering to write about type specimens in the first place. So in addition to teaching history, I also teach in the studio. One of my favorite classes to teach is Typography 1, and I'm really pretty passionate about introducing students to the historical context of typography as a discipline and a practice, and a way that humans communicate with each other, and a way that we engage with our discipline. And I want this to be relevant for them as human beings who have personal and cultural identities and who are preparing to enter professional practice. They're probably not preparing to be typographic historians, but they're preparing to use typography as part of their everyday practice. So if you Google type specimens, you get a lot of mostly unhelpful results. You get a lot of student projects thinking about Helvetica or Baskerville, and that's interesting if that's what you're looking for, but it's not very helpful if you would like to acquire some sort of understanding of making and selling and using typography throughout history and around the world. I was super fortunate in that I got to spend some time with a fellowship at the RIT Carey Collection, one of the nation's leading print history collections. So shout out to everybody at the Carey who heroically toted around tons of big books and then filled the largest ever photographic order from the archive for me. The Carey's collection is pretty heavily situated in Western Europe and North America. Fortunately, since I visited there in 2015, both at the Carey and around the country, many collections, many archives are expanding their scope and their reach to include more and more global examples, which is super exciting. So just kind of as a reference point, the book that emerged from that fellowship and from other research that I had been doing about typography and printing history looks at specimens again. Shout outs to the Carey librarians who introduced me to their collection in this way that thinks about physical format. So posters, printers, manuals, foundry specimens, other kinds of ephemera. And as I was researching in the Carey collection, I was glimpsing, but only glimpsing, all of these gaps in the story that we tell ourselves about typography. The story we tell about typographic practice, typographic history, typographic form is super well developed if you're interested in what happened in Western Europe and North America. That's awesome. But what if you're interested in things that happened in other places? It's so much harder to track down that information. So I was taking particular note of these gaps. For example, Japanese bookmaking, as observed by a German printmaker who lived in Japan for over a decade. Hebrew wood type. A lot of Hebrew wood type was produced in New York in the early 20th century for newspaper printing. This is a Maruba tag style typeface. Roughly 192 points. The Carey collection has a bunch of really beautiful Hebrew wood type that I was able to see. And then finally, we're looking at two images from a monotype book. It was kind of a corporate history slash anniversary souvenir. And they're showing us here the janitorial staff, which they praise for maintaining the cleanliness of the factory. The typists who are shown here being tested for speed and for accuracy. And the text inside this publication says, wherein, like inside this book, we talk about ourselves, our factory, and the men whose genius is making typography better. They certainly weren't talking about these black men who they are showing as janitorial staff. They aren't talking about the women who are typists. They're talking about someone else, and it's not women and it's not people of color. As I uncovered all of these materials, I was interested in thinking about how including them in our story really enriches design practice, not only for the people who might see themselves reflected very specifically, for instance, people who read Bengali, um, but for all of us, understanding our discipline in all of its complexity. Sometimes it's ugliness, sometimes it's beauty. Having access to a more complete story, never a perfectly complete story, but a more complete story, is really important. So I am specifically looking here at quote foreign language faces from Linotype. And Linotype was very interested in altering various global scripts during production. They sometimes did this by making the alphabet or the character set smaller, just throwing away characters that they thought were useless. And sometimes they did this by altering the shapes of letter forms. So Linotype was really interested, as were almost all type founders at this point in time, really interested in this wide pattern of both cultural suppression and cultural exchange. They were interested in being able to facilitate typesetting around the globe in local languages, mostly because it was a money-making proposition. But they were also interested in changing those local languages to be more like the Latin alphabet so that they would work better with existing technologies. And we see that duality reflected in the way that lots of local audiences used typography as a tool for resistance and for self-definition, even as colonizers and type designers, who were sometimes the same people, were trying to use those same tools for suppression. Understanding the details and the nuance and the conflict of these kinds of stories really does, I would argue, enrich design practice by letting us understand how design works and the work that design does in different contexts. Kind of on the flip side of that coin, I was really interested in inviting and welcoming as many users of type as possible. And so I collaborated with so many amazing librarians and archivists and teachers, professional designers, digital type foundries. We're looking here at an automated response from Aleph Aleph Aleph, a Hebrew-focused type foundry in Israel. And of course, I was interested in telling plural stories. One of the features I'm proudest of in the book as a piece of research is the visual glossary that runs along the outer edge of all of the pages. And these glossary entries tell stories, often the story of somebody who's felt excluded by design, the way it's traditionally been defined. There are 318 visual glossary entries, and my goal was to make sure that each one of them included something that had previously been excluded from typographic history, even while defining familiar words and phrases. Um, the more I worked on this project, the more I came to realize that this is how we make change. We very literally write it into our histories, and sometimes that is not very sexy or exciting work. Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's just really hard work. But this is how we make change. We do the work of writing back in the stories that our discipline has historically written out of our narrative of professionalization. Um, I'm finding that doing this work sometimes results in kind of a why bother mood from some audiences, but I still believe that it's super important work. And I believe that hopefully students will join in the effort of including themselves in design history's narratives and including others, including the people around them. And every tiny instance of praxis and context matters because it changes something that used to be a stereotype and replaces it with real information. So, for instance, Lisa Huang was generous enough to allow herself to be included in the digital futures chapter of the book. And she researched Noto Sans Nushu for Google Fonts and designed this typeface in collaboration with real users of Nushu, a very niche script developed and used by women in a remote part of China. And so replacing Oriental style type with something that is designed with real people in a real context is important work every single time. So just a couple of examples from the research process in the book, thinking about the relationship between hot metal typography and Asia very, very broadly defined. So linotype, first, a tiny bit of context. So linotype is a system of turning liquid hot metal into lines of type. And Linotype was really interested in expanding their market to as many places as possible. And thinking about how this technology is part of global typographic practice, the really familiar story talks to us about how white male typecasters and typesetters are experts in this hot metal typographic technology. As chronology progresses, this technology becomes more antiquated, less cutting edge, and so the story becomes about how white male typecasters find themselves unemployed or needing to train for new kinds of work in the printing industry. So as I was thinking about what is hot metal typography, how can I design a timeline that helps readers understand this both as a technology and as a tool of often cultural colonization. I wanted to be able to think about linotype as an example of a technology that is attempting to universalize, which is kind of the opposite of globalizing in some ways, depending on how you're defining both words, right? But in this conversation, linotype itself uses the word universalize to sort of mean everybody needs to be the same, everybody needs to be more like us, whereas perhaps a more global perspective would recognize that there are many kinds of users. Um, all of them are different from one another. The technologies that they use might also be different. And then how does design support those human beings and meet their needs? So, um, even even this story about hot metal type in the United States is a story that often leaves out many perspectives. This is a newspaper photo from 1940s Chicago showing black men at work setting type for one of the city's newspapers with an abolitionist heritage. Um, these are small details, perhaps, definitely, perhaps forgotten historical images, but an example of the ways in which a dominant narrative writes out, trims out designers who have always been here and always been part of the story. They just haven't been included. One more technical detail to understand about hot metal type before we look at a few examples of how hot metal type is represented and discussed in Asia. It is a fairly complicated technology, lots of moving parts. Catalogs for parts are nice and chunky, great for doorstops. So this technology really does impact language and scripts and printing and reading around the world. In part because Linotype is interested in making sure that all of the languages work with this very specific and quite complicated technology that they have developed. And this leads to a really systemic worldview that becomes about making sure that other languages behave more like the Latin alphabet. So as I was putting together the timelines that introduce each chapter, I was interested in using them as an opportunity to introduce global stories and to see those stories as part of our multivocal or pluriversal or inclusive story of typographic history. These are elements of, indeed, the history of visual communication design. And just because we don't have the complete story, maybe one day we will, maybe we never will have all of these complete stories. That incompleteness doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't acknowledge that these stories are part of the heritage of our discipline. So since I've been thinking about how did I research Asian and maybe more specifically Southeast Asian typographic stories, here is one example of that specifically in relationship to hot metal type. So Linotype Arabic 22 was the first successful mechanical typeface in the Arabic script. It followed a failed attempt at simplified Arabic by Linotype. This was taking place around maybe 1911. And that simplified Arabic project cut the number of characters in Arabic. So it just got rid of a whole bunch of characters so that, quote, Arab literature could flourish. Arabic 22, on the other hand, was developed in close collaboration with Arabic readers and with the newspaper staff at Al Hoda in New York City, where there was a large immigrant population that read Arabic. And different members of the team brought different skills, different areas of expertise, and all of those were heard and applied in the project, which was one of the things that allowed it to be successful. You can read more about the project, lots more about the project, in Arabic Typography by Titus Nemus. I was also interested in Indian scripts. This is a super complex history that, as someone who doesn't read any Indian languages, I was eager to research well enough to include some of these moments in the history of typographic printing. So at the time when I was writing, Devanagari was the script that was most accessible for English language researchers. So I followed type designers and researchers online, on Alphabet, on Typotheek, on Type Together. These turned out to be pretty excellent sources. Devanagari is related to Hindi. So I became interested in the story of the Hindi Revision Committee of the Indian Congress. Linotype was again heavily involved in this simplification process as part of their globalization process. So why bother? I've actually had lots of folks ask me this question. Why bother? Why try to be global? Why gather stories that haven't been told yet, even if they are stories that aren't yet complete? Why make the attempt to address colonization and networks of cultural and technological exchange in relation to a subject that's already been written to death, like typography? So, in answer, I would share this photo from the Smithsonian Archives, and says the Smithsonian, inventor Hari Govind worked with the Mergenthaler Linotype Company to design and perfect printing equipment for the Hindi language based on the Devanagari alphabet. That's it. That's the whole story. That's everything that the Smithsonian needs us to know about Hari Govind. And don't get me wrong, I'm super excited that these images are in the public domain. I'm glad that the Smithsonian introduced me to this man and to what he is doing here in this photo. He's celebrating the debut of the Hindi linotype machine, which is bedecked here with these beautiful garlands of flowers. But the context that he was working in was really complex and a lot longer than this photo implies. Linotype's globalization project had been ongoing for at least 2 decades. There had been many failed attempts to simplify scripts, particularly Asian scripts, so that they would work on the Latin alphabet-based machinery. Working with Govind as a named collaborator, I mean, they name him, they share his photo, was a huge step for the company at this moment in time. And even though we look back on that and we feel some righteous scorn, like just a photo, just 2 sentences, what? This history is useful to us, and thinking about why and how it is incomplete is also useful to us as designers. So particularly in the USA right now at this moment in time, as a person who is white, I am convinced that I need to be hard at work uncovering and amplifying stories of co-design and designers cooperating across cultures and countries and languages, collaborating across personal and social identities. I feel like we really in the USA need to keep saying out loud that equal, respectful, collaborative design work among diverse partners is vital. Our profession will wither without this respect. Another example of Linotype's approach to typographic universality is this Japanese typeface Shimbun Katsuji Bokai, which literally means newspaper type matrix. So it's type for a newspaper, designed in 1951. Back in November of 1920, Hyakuzo Iwata founded the Iwata Matrix Company in a neighborhood in Tokyo and began production of type matrices. And primarily, this project was in support of newspaper publication projects in Japan. English language papers had been in wide circulation since the 1880s, but Japanese type took a bit to emerge because the very large character set was very tricky for mechanical casting and setting. And here, this time in 1951, we're seeing a project where local makers and users and readers were very active, where they were named as designers in the process, and where collaboration was being practiced in a mutual and respectful way instead of as a form of theft. So we can look at how the advertisements for this typography designed in Japan may be similar to or different from linotype and monotype in the United States and Western Europe in different ways. And there are many ways that we, as a contemporary audience, might respond to this material. We might, like early British and American type designers did when local speakers began designing their own type matrices, we might say, "That's bad type!" Exclamation point, exclamation point. Spoiler alert, white male typographers and type historians still to this day visit BIPOC and feminist blogs to leave "this is bad type" comments in the comment section. And reviewer two of type specimens said that I shouldn't be showing, quote, "bad type" to emerging typographers. Rather, I should be showing only historically acknowledged exemplars. And I would argue that this comment means that we need more of us working toward global histories, not fewer of us. As an audience, we could also, and very differently, decry the fact that type designers around the world were, at best, being strong-armed into using technologies that were originally designed for the Latin alphabet. And that's a fair critique. There's a history of exploitation and silencing going on here that definitely we need access to. We need to be able to understand that as part of our discipline. Or we could see this global user in his own environment. It's a he in this case, and he's seizing the technology of production and he's using it to meet the needs of the local community. They needed a quickly produced daily newspaper in a readable Japanese font. I would argue that we really, really need this story as designers and design historians. Would it be best if the designer, Iwata, had written his own account of this? maybe that would be the best. That story would be in Japanese. Should only readers of Japanese have access to the story? I would argue no. We need access to this story in many languages. Is this English language sliver of history limited? Of course it is. I would hope that students in my classroom, in your classroom, will see themselves and be curious and tell more of the story. I hope I've already had a conversation with a student who, instead of a Beatrice Ward moment, had a Hari Govind moment. That would be amazing. I would love that. So right now, today, I am continuing this work. Before I joined you this morning, I was looking at Bixing, whose original clay-based typographic, movable typographic printing process um, was developed around 1088 in China, and then deployed as a technology, but this time with wood typographic sorts instead of clay in 1297 by Wang Qin, to publish Nungshu, which is a text on agriculture and farming in his region. And so here in 1297, we have the first mass-produced movable typographic printed book in history, which again I encountered because I followed the footnotes in a story that a student shared with me, um, who said, "Oh yeah, of course, every school child in Asia knows that Gutenberg didn't invent movable typographic printing like that. That's just common knowledge. What do you mean that's news to you? That's super surprising. Everybody knows this." Um, so thinking about networks of knowledge and I think being willing to learn from our students is exciting. Um, I also love learning from folks who just randomly get in touch with me. I love to read, I love to write, I love to teach, and I love to talk with anybody who wants to talk about type history. So I hope, especially for folks who might be watching and listening later on after this has been recorded, that means you. It really does. Please be in touch. And together, I genuinely believe that we can be respectful of each other, we can be curious about each other.